Welcome, everyone. Welcome to All Vines, New Varieties and Sustainable Viticulture in collaboration with Wine Australia. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm quite excited about this webinar. I think that I've been planning this with Wine Australia for about 4 years. I'm exaggerating, but I was quite excited to do something with Australia because in the context of climate change, there are so many, I think that Australia has been experiencing what is now becoming a new reality in many countries. They have a lot of experience with extreme. And so as a result, they've had to find ways to adapt, perhaps before other places, other countries. And they've also done a lot of research. And now today they have that research for Australia, but also sharing this research for with regions from all over the world. I also think that Australia's advantage is that they don't have the regulations of other countries in Europe when it comes to grapes and vinification and viticulture. So when they do research and they find solution, I think they can adapt it much quicker. So it'll be interesting to discuss all of those topics today with my two panelists. Before we start, just a few housekeeping. If you have questions, please put them into the chat at the bottom. We'll answer some of those questions during the webinar, and also at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for a question period. This is the first series of the OFF program of Tasting Climate Change. We had a lot of free webinars this year. So if you go to tastingclimatechange.com, you will see all of the webinars that we have scheduled. So far, we have 4. The next one is on April 20th on the role of microbiology in climate change. So if you're very geeky about vinification and microbes, it's going to be very interesting. If you want to post or share questions, you can share on Twitter and also on Instagram with Tasting Climate Change. When we decided the topics that we are going to talk about today, we had a long list. I had many pages and we could have done about 10 seminars with today's information, but we decided to focus on some specific topics. And even today, we won't have time to go into extreme depth about them all. The idea is perhaps to share some of those few solutions with you, and then you get thinking and share those ideas with others. If you look in your chat right now, my two panelists, I will introduce you shortly, they've already put some links for you. So after the seminar, if you want to go and research further on those topics, you can actually look at those links. So today, to talk about the Climate Atlas, Old Vine, Regenerative Agriculture, Alternative Grapes, Water, and Packaging, I have with me Dr. Liz Water. Liz has a PhD in wine science from the University of Adelaide and is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Liz has responsibility for Wine Australia's research, development, and adaptation programs. She works in collaboration with a group of research providers to deliver short and long-term value for the Australian wine industry and give them tools to be sustainable and have prosperity. When I emailed Liz and asked her information, she sent me so many different links and information. I'm looking forward to hearing some of the research that she has to share with us. And with us also is Dr. GRIGG. Dylan has a PhD in viticulture, and his doctoral thesis actually was focused on grapevine age and quality measurements among some of the other oldest vine in the world. Dylan has been working in viticulture for more than 20 years. He has broad experience, he's worked in many countries, including Spain and Australia, meaning he has a lot of different experience with different climate, but also different grapes. So without further ado, we are going to start with talking about the Climate Atlas. So when we talk about climate change, there's 2 important things. One is adaptation, how do you adapt? And the other part is how do you mitigate climate change? So to talk about adaptation, Australia has something quite unique in the way that they actually have developed a climate atlas to help producers to see what's coming in the future in terms of climate and make decision in relation to this atlas and the projection. Liz Water, welcome to this seminar, and thank you for getting up so early. It's 5:30 in the morning for you. So thanks for joining us. Liz, what is the Climate Atlas and how is it supposed to help producers?
Thanks, Michelle, and I'm delighted to be here. Yes, it's early, but climate change and talking about some of the research, some of my favourite things to do, so thanks for the opportunity. So the Climate Atlas is first and foremost a planning tool, and you know, we've all heard about the projections for how temperature will increase, but what does that actually mean for a producer or for a grape grower in a particular region? So what this atlas is about, it's taking some very clever and climatology research, I guess, and turning it into something that viticulturists and producers can use. Really fine scale temperature maps, projections for the short, the long, the medium and the long term, so out to 2100. And not just talking about temperature, but actually turning this information into the sort of metrics, I guess you'd say, that viticulturists need, like, understand. So how is the growing season temperature going to change? What's happening to growing degree days? Rainfall in particular during the growing season, heat extremes. So, really information that they need, that they use already for planning on every region, every grape growing region in Australia. So as by way of example, the Hunter Valley in 80 years' time will have more days of extreme heat. Yeah, so that, we sort of know that's probably going to happen. But when you look at days of extreme heat, days over 35 degrees, actually that has implications for labour. Like, we can't send people out to work under those sorts of conditions. So it's actually a planning tool for future research as well. Robots or autonomous vehicles in vineyards, we're going to absolutely need to have more of those in the future. So that's a bit of an overview. The atlas itself, you can access it on the Wine Australia website. You can go down into as much detail as you like for all your favourite regions. But another important aspect of it is that, a region can look at where they will be in 50 years' time, and they can find a region that's currently experiencing those conditions. So, for example, Coonawarra will be like Margaret River. Coonawarra in 50 years' time might be like Margaret River is right now. Or you can look internationally at wine regions and think, okay, well, my region is going to be like Bordeaux is now, for example. So it really helps plan for, understand how climate change projections will impact on wine regions in the future in a way that's understandable for and very tangible for growers. Michelle, I'm going to come back to you. I'm happy to talk more about it, but I feel like that's a bit of a whole lot of information out there.
Thanks, Liz. I have a question for you in terms of when you do the projection, because what we project now, I imagine it's based on what we think the temperature increase is going to be, but are you taking into consideration the CO2 level? Because right now, the degree that we're gaining is related to the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So do you have many different projection? A, if it goes at high, B, because I imagine if I'm a producer and I'm not sure where it's going to be, it's difficult to make a decision.
Sure. So the data was used 6 of the, well, probably what was considered the most likely models looking at rising CO2 temperatures, and that was that was the data from 2019 when the atlas was put together, and the predictions they're not predictions, they're projections within the atlas are based on the worst case scenario from 2019, which is actually what we're tracking on now. We're tracking a little bit higher than that. So it didn't take a conservative approach, it took a realistic approach, as it's turned out. perhaps slightly conservative. Yeah, but very much based on the the best models, international models that are available, and then to do the projections for how things will change over the next 80 years.
And in your experience, have you seen a lot of producers already using it in terms of where they're planting and where the next move is?
Yeah. So we've had some really great responses, and I can talk about it in general terms because I guess some of this is commercial in confidence for individual producers. But I know that Coonawarra as a whole region have used the Climate Atlas to plan through. They've looked at that and they thought, okay, so what do we need to do in the short term to help our growers and producers adapt to the changes we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, and then where are we going to be in the next, what research, what actions do we have to take now to be in a good position in 50 and 80 years time. So as a regional tool, we know it's being used. We know that some individual wine companies are looking at, particularly if they've got vineyards in different places across Australia, they're looking at it as a tool for, 20, 50 years time, what should we replant in this region? Where should we plant more? Where should we plant less? Where should we plant different varieties? So yeah, it's already being used exactly how we wanted it to be.
Have we seen a surge of vine being planted in Tasmania?
Yeah, well, I mean, you probably didn't need the Climate Atlas for that one.
Yes.
And of course, that happened before the Climate Atlas. And interestingly, this work was done by a group of climatologists from Tasmania. So, they're on the ball down there.
It's smart. Thank you. I'll definitely come back to you, Liz. I'm going to go to Dylan and talk in keeping with the question of adaptation. One of the question is, are all vines better adapted to climate change? And I have to say, I invite you, everyone. Dylan has a lot of presentation on Old Vine with the Old Vine symposiums. If you Google on YouTube, you can watch them. And I've watched them, pretty much them all. And everything that I've watched made, like, every preconceived idea I had about Old Vines, I came out thinking about something completely differently. It really takes away your preconceived idea of Old Vine. So I invite you to watch it because we're not going to have to go over everything today. But Dylan, thank you so much for being there. I know it's in the middle of the harvest and we're lucky to have you. Can you share with us your research on Old Vine in terms of how they can adapt to climate change, if they can?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Michelle. It's great to be in this presentation, and I've put a link to one of those presentations that's a little bit more scientific over in the chat from oldvines.org. Now I'm going to share my screen. We'll test that. Share this guy. Bear with me. Presenter. Oh, not Spanish. How's that, Michelle? Is that good? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you. It's perfect.
Great. Cool. So I'm not going to propose that old vines are going to be the cure-all for climate change, but I think through my research and spending a lot of time thinking and talking and working with old vines, I think there's some lessons from the past that we can learn that can help with our not only adaptation but mitigation. So I'm just going to run through those sort of things really quite quickly now, just to spur on a bit more discussion. So about me, further to Michelle's introduction, I'm a viticulture freelance consultant and also a practicing viticulturalist. So I get out there with dirty boots and manage vineyards and also work in my own vineyard. I work across quite a number of growing regions in Australia, from east to west and down to Tasmania, and also in Europe, with also touch points in South Africa. So I hear a lot of what's going on with shifting climates and challenges in growing seasons, and all of the swings and roundabouts of this changing climate that we're dealing with. I've become somewhat of an old vine specialist, which was probably the seed was planted when I did my very first pruning season, which was with, back then, 100-year-old vines in the Barossa Valley, and then coming back home to the Barossa to study the PhD gave me a lot more time and insight into old vines. And when I'm not doing these things, I spend a bit of time with my family and work on our own vineyard, which is in the Barossa. So what do we know about old vines? I guess everyone knows that if you're leaning on a bar in a tasting room, people always talk about how they're highly prized and they're also highly valued. You'll see that people will trade off of having older vines because of rarity, and then align that with quality. This isn't something that only occurs in, funnily enough, New World regions that have very old vines or that avoided phylloxera, but it's a global phenomenon, as you can see by like the oldvine.org, which is an organisation that's pushing to have older vineyards as a sector in the wine industry. So we know that vines can get really old. We know that vines can get over 400, 500 years old. But a lot of the vineyards that we've got many, many hectares around the world, will not get to be that old. So there must be some sort of driver for this vine age. That might be the soil, the site selection, perhaps. It may be plant resilience. It may be human stubbornness to not pull them out when everyone says they should. But some of these things, if we look into a little bit deeper, might give us some clues that can help us move forward through a changing climate. So I established a lot of my knowledge and had a lot of time to read and think about old vines, studying for my PhD, which was funded by Wine Australia and the University of Adelaide. No one had really studied old vines. There had been only one, we'll call it 1.5, because it wasn't a pure study on old vines, because it's very, very difficult to set up age as a treatment variable in a scientific context. In the Barossa Valley, we're very, very lucky. Well, we're very lucky in Australia, but in the Barossa especially, because we have some very old vines that are now well over 170 years old. And we have some pretty stubborn growers that didn't pull things out and would plant younger vines next to the older vines. So this was an opportunistic study that used vines which were genetically related and within the same soil type with the same management, which is very difficult to set up in other parts of the world, or to set up, you need to wait another 170 years to get a good test. The vine ages that we looked at, the average age gap was around 90 years, which is by and far more significant than other studies that have been done in US or even Europe. And a lot of this is down to the fact that in the Barossa, the vines are on their own roots because we haven't had the phylloxera reset or the replanting and reconstitution on rootstocks, which kind of resets the clock on vine age. I know in Europe there are some sandy soils and there's some areas where there's small plantings that are still on own roots, but in Australia in particular, we have large areas in several states that have significant vine age. So the study was set up to test the anecdotal evidence from the tasting room and what people talk about, and try and see what the scientific evaluation or scientific rigor would say about some of these discussion points. So it was a very wide-ranging study because no one had done this before. It wasn't, the goal wasn't to come out with one single answer. It was to try and increase our general knowledge and hopefully find some threads that some other people can pull and some future research can follow. So we looked at everything from physiology to grape chemistry, grape flavor, wine sensory, wine chemistry. There was metabolomic analysis, targeted and non-targeted, and also genetic and epigenetic analysis of the vines. There's, I don't know where it is, but in the chat, there's a link to my oldvine.org, one of my presentations with Tim Atkin, which I go into a little bit more of the science. But what did we find? Well, we found it was very, very difficult to write up and to try and pull clear messages out of the research. I remember one of a great mentor and friend, Professor Peter Dry, said, Dylan, it's a very challenging study because we haven't set up an experiment, changed one thing and then measure the response. With age as the variable, the response is going to potentially be clouded by terroir or by time. So it was really quite a challenge, but what we did find, in short, was that, and which is probably what, Michelle, you're referring to, is we found that within our cohort of 5 vineyards, that the older vines had a greater yield in terms of fruit production. They also had a greater vegetative yield in terms of vegetative growth, which the two are probably related in terms of vine size. Older vines, they generally had better winemaking qualities in terms of basic chemistry, so a lower pH and a better TA at a similar BOME. And in our sensory studies found that there were differences between old and young vines in terms of their flavour profiles. And the last bit on the molecular side of things is we found that genetically, even though an old vine and a young vine that can be genetically identical, over time, epigenetically, there is differences or an accumulation of epigenetic markers in the older vines. And doing a little more research, which hopefully someone else can expand on, is that the regions of the genome that were found to have these epigenetic markers or adaptions were concentrated around sites that are known biosynthetic pathways for stress and adaptation. What are some of the lessons that we can take, not only from my study, but from my experience working with old vines in many vineyards, is site selection. I mean, how do these vines grow old? They grow old probably because they're good vines, and they were planted in good soils. And these were planted, some of these were planted, you know, nearly 200 years ago. So it's not like they were exploring the fringes of a region. Many of the old vineyards, so out of the 5 that I had, if you were to look and had one straight kick with a football, you'd probably find an ephemeral stream or a watercourse. If we remember that drip irrigation wasn't invented until the 70s, in establishing these things in the 1800s or early 19th century, they were probably irrigated in hard years or as baby vines by buckets. So there's a little hint as to how we're establishing our vineyards that that might be used to improve perhaps the rooting qualities or how they fit into their site. The other thing is that in the Barossa Valley, as one region, is if you find a very old vineyard, you'll often find a very big gum tree nearby. And there are stories that some of the first vineyards sites were found by looking for a stream or looking for a very big gum tree, because if there was a big gum, it was probably into some water. So some of the best soils and sites are still holding vines. Another hint that we can look at, and this one has also been supported in scientific research in Europe, is that older vineyards were often planted on wider spacings than what we have now, where they're set up for mechanisation and efficiency. And with financial drivers, we're trying to get more money off of a smaller unit of land. Whereas in the past, where vines were planted on wider spacings, it means that each individual plant has a larger cubic capacity of soil to extract nutrients and water, which could be a method to use the limiting resource of soil and of water within the soil. Another thing that if we look at old vines, I mean, if you follow my Instagram, I post ad nauseum pictures of old vines because I find that they're beautiful in their structure. But one thing that they have, which modern vineyards don't, is often have a non-restrictive canopy in terms of the trellis construction. So we now have trellising for mechanisation, and we force these vines to be bonsaied and stay within a certain fruiting zone. Whereas if vines are planted on very wide spacings, they've got room to grow. If old vines, like in this example here, you can see the main trunk area was very low to the ground, and it's been allowed to expand over the decades, avoiding large cuts. And avoiding large cuts may reduce some trunk disease ingression, but also hold some more carbohydrates. So I challenge anyone out there, if they're interested in old vines, or if you're ever in a situation talking about old vines, ask what sort of pruning method there is, because the majority that I see are spur pruned vines and not cane pruned vines, because cane pruning keeps the vine crown in a certain position, and wrapping down new canes requires different cuts to be made to the vine over time, compared to spur pruning, where spur pruning naturally is more respectful to the sap flow and reducing the cut size. But the problem is that with some of this, with the increasing amounts of wood, is that you don't have as many opportunities for mechanisation, and there's often reset cuts that are made. In terms of vine size and working with spur pruned vines, and I hinted at it in my study as well, is that vines can get pretty big. Like some vines can get taller than me, even without unsupported without a trellis. If the correct varieties have been pruned well and planted in the right spot, they can be quite erect and self-supporting, even though they're vines and not trees. My study inferred that these older vines had a greater storage capacity of carbohydrates, and this carbohydrate storage may offer a buffer or some resilience to not only seasonal shifts in climate, but stresses, because people often anecdotally say that older vines, whereas younger vines will swing a lot with seasons, whereas older vines are more steady and more consistent. And this larger plant body may be a driver of that. In recent times, I think it was late last year, there was a study that came out of Cal Poly which was in Zinfandel in California, which looked at old vines, and they found that older vines, perhaps due to their size, had greater water use efficiency and didn't race ahead in their phenology compared to younger vines, which kind of also ties in. We know that grapevines can display a high level of plasticity in their growth. So plasticity is their response to their site. Chardonnay grows all over the world in every country, but the results aren't the same. You can grow it in a lean soil and it's tiny. You can grow it in a vigorous soil and it's huge. The same is for every variety. They have capacity to adapt. We can and do exploit this in terms of the vines trying to adapt, and we're trying to mitigate. But in terms of the plastic limit, there are limits. So any vine, genetically, no matter what age there is, we will only be able to exploit its plasticity to a certain limit before we need to take more action or be more careful. But it's something that we can also take from old vines and have a look at vineyards that have been around for 200 years, or old remnant forests that might have pre-phylloxera of vines, single vines, to search for clones that are performing well, that are stronger than others in their field. that are showing more isohydric behaviour than others. And that kind of ties back to the vine age piece where we saw the epigenetic adaptation or the adaptation with time. Perhaps there's, in the old vineyards, there's something that we can look into, because you will hear more about epigenetics and pre-stressing plants so that they stress less in the future. I think coming to the end of this little presentation, I think old vines can help. We still have a hell of a lot to learn, and I'm sure there's other studies that can come out and look at other varieties, because my research was just looking at Shiraz because it's a very important variety and these vines were very, very old. But I think some of the key things, the take homes, if we look back to old vineyards, what can we take? We should be planting for the future, and we should be planting and managing so that our vineyards can be old, because establishment costs are only going up, and the longer you can have a vineyard in the ground, the longer it can pay back. And the longer we can have a vineyard in the ground, perhaps the less water we can use in establishment and moderating its growth. So site selection, plant on a good site and get a viticulturist to do a good study with a climate atlas or with GIS to make sure that you're within the bands of what the variety and rootstock combination can perform. Vine density, there may be clues and cues into how we're planting to deal with limiting resources. Rootstocks, hopefully Michelle's going to bring that up as a question so that we can discuss that, because they're definitely a tool that we can use and take going forward. And the knowledge of pruning. Let's look back to look forward and see how we can prune our modern vineyards to perhaps last as long as some of these long-lived vineyards we have around the world. Not all vineyards are in the right position or managed in the right way to grow old, and that is still in some people's business plan, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think there's some clues we can take. If you, sorry about my squeaky chair, if you want some more information, look me up, come say hello. I'm pretty active on a couple of socials, and I'll shoot back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Dylan. I have a million questions, of course. We have questions also from people, but we're going to have to move along. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I know you're anxious to talk about something that you wanted me to ask a question. Do you want to talk about this first? You just said, I hope Michelle asks a question on this. Do you want to expand on this a bit more right away?
I can't remember. Tell me. Go, shoot.
You were talking about the nutrients availability, I believe.
I thought you were going to ask me about epigenetics, but no, just ask me.
Oh no, I had a question about epigenetics because I watched another videos about this. Okay, yes. so let's go back to this because can you explain a bit further what it is? Because I know what it is because I've watched the other presentation and you go much into more depth about epigenetic and so explain what it is, and then how can this inform us? How can this help us down the road to replicate this epigenetic if it's possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can replicate it. So epigenetics, very in layman's terms, very loosely, is above genetics. So the plants have their genome, and the expression of their genome results in the phenotype, which is how they grow, which is the shape of the leaf, the color of the fruit, the flavor. Plants are sessile, so they can't move. All organisms have the ability to modify the expression of their genome, and there's a few mechanisms, and they're grouped together to be called epigenetic mechanisms, which are above genetics. So they're a modifier. Plants can't move, so they exploit this to modify and adapt to their specific situation. So there are a lot of studies that have shown that plants can moderate their phenotype and how they interact with their environment by changing their epigenetic markers. Now, epigenetic markers are like dog ears in a book. You know, if you've got a favorite passage or something, you might dog ear the page. That's your epigenetic marker. You get further through the book, a year later, you look back and go, oh, what was that passage? You can go back and re-review that little section. But epigenetic markers are heritable, so they can be passed on, but they can also be reversed, so you can unclip that page. Over time, epigenetic markers can accumulate, and they have been shown to be used as a stress response. So, for example, if we just take it back to old vines, if a vineyard's planted in the 1850s, and let's just say in the early 1900s, there's a very stressful period. When a plant goes through a stress event, it will have a stress response, and it can use an epigenetic mechanism to remember that stress response, so that when that same situation arises in the future, it stresses less. So plants have been shown in the lab to, if they're exposed to a stress, there's an epigenetic change, and when they're re-exposed to that same stress, the response is moderated. So what we found was that the oldest plants had the greatest number of epigenetic markers. We didn't go as far as to say we infer what they do. We didn't actually do real-time RNA sequencing or anything like that. But we found that the older the vine, the more epigenetic markers that it carried, and we knew where they were located on the genome, and we infer that they are in relation to stress responses, which may be some of these things like anthocyanins and plant adaptations to environment are also related to some quality indexes. Did I answer that? I think so.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite complex. I'm following you, but
Yeah.
I have a question in that regard. Is it a bit like one of the same reason, maybe not necessarily on old vine as old as 170 years old, but let's say, you know, there's a lot of people right now in terms of adapting to climate change are doing sélection massale, because they're going through a vineyard and saying, okay, this plant is exactly the same DNA, same clone, but is actually developed, has adapted differently, and is actually becoming more resistant to heat than the other plants. So they take that and bring it to the nursery, and then, you know, do a sélection massale from all the plants. So would you say that it's kind of a form of epigenic? Is it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'll say that the one caveat on that is the one thing. So you're right. A lot of people are doing selection massale, and I even mentioned it, is looking within these, because the very old vineyards weren't selected. They're not clonal, they're polyclonal. So they're full of genetic individuals. Grapevines have been propagated via cuttings or vegetatively since antiquity. That's how you keep a variety as a variety. And they've got a lot of, they've got a very, I wouldn't say dirty genome, but they've got a lot of genes in there that perhaps are useful that some may exploit. And there's always mutations that are going on. So selection massale exploits some of those germline mutations that are occurring. Yes, people will see some epigenetic drivers, perhaps, but my study, we found that when you take a cutting, there's actually a rejuvenation process and the epigenetic profile changes. So where you have an old vine and you layer a cane, the mother and the daughter are genetically identical and epigenetically identical because they're connected. You can cut them and the daughter stays with the same profile as the mother, which is to that side. But when we took a cutting and planted that, those epigenetic markers fell off, for want of a better term, fell off, and that plant was then juvenile and it had to go through the process of readapting to the site. So I think if we're selecting strong genetics, then of course, when we add our epigenetics over time, we're going to have good plant material and high quality plant material. So definitely selection is a big part of it, but it takes a long time for a plant to adapt to its site. And scientific studies have shown this through tissue culture and through all sorts of different methodologies with epigenetics, that if you separate a mother and daughter, or you separate two plants, put them in different environments, their epigenetic profiles will diverge. Put them back in the same environment, they'll converge. So
Okay.
it's an environmental adaptation. So plant selection is a very important thing.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question before we go to Liz, and then we'll come back at the end because there's lots of questions coming in. So please come in, keep on sending your questions. We'll address them at the end. One more question I have. So if we go back to climate change, and from your research and what you found in terms of knowing that the carbohydrates can help probably the plant to be stronger against heat and disease and water intakes, how does it inform? Because it's great to know that, but let's say that you're working with a client who has to replant some vines. How does this knowledge that you have right now is helping you, is informing you the decision when you have to plant a new vine?
I think that it informs in the structure of the vine and the trellis. So the one thing I will say is we're inferring, based on scientific studies, that the carbohydrates are acting as a buffer, and there's quite a bit of research out there that goes into that in much more detail. But I think if you were to take that knowledge and go, right, what would that actually mean? Then perhaps it would mean that it's better to keep more living wood in your vine and your vine structure when you're pruning, instead of cutting back, which of course cuts have other implications. But it really implies, and the scientific literature shows, that it can help with buffering extremes. And so one really important period is pre-flowering, the vegetative burst, in spring, because before the vines are actually photosynthesizing, before the leaves are big enough, they're pushing from their reserves from the previous season. So if you've got good carbohydrate storage, you can get good initial push, which means you've got good leaf area and you can capitalize on good floral initiation from the previous season. So it can act as a little bit of a buffer, but I mean, Liz might go into it as well, that we also now know that it's not just down to carbohydrates, and you need to have winter rainfall to have good growth in spring.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you, but we got to go to the next topic because I know we're going to have just as much questions. So thank you so much, Dylan. The other topic that I wanted to discuss today is regenerative agriculture. I've practiced this word because it's hard for the French people to say that word. And I was quite anxious to talk about it because, first of all, I think there's a lot of misconception about what it is. We mix organic and biodynamic, with regenerative agriculture when it's something not quite the same. And also there's a lot of people saying, well, in countries like Australia, where the soil are so old and more poor, it's perhaps more challenging. Yet there are some people who have shown that it's possible. One of them is Vanya Cullen. So before we go to Liz and she shares her research with us, I've asked Vanya to do 2 short videos of what her definition is of regenerative agriculture, because today Vanya is carbon negative as a result. Whoops, wrong one.
Regenerative agriculture is where you restore land that has been, I suppose, poorly farmed to enable it to capture and store carbon. The biodynamic practices that we do, the compost, the bedding preparations, the cover crops, enable the carbon dioxide not to be blown off the soil when it gets cycled essentially and held in the soil. And those practices of having healthy, alive soils through the microbiological life of preparation 500 and the actual soil structure and the plant life, the biodiversity of the plant life of the cover crops all contribute. It's not any one thing. It's many things that contribute to that. It's like creating a system of, we like to think a native forest, but more than that. In our becoming carbon, we call it carbon positive or carbon negative, where our soils are sequestering and holding more carbon than our whole business emits. This process has been through all of that, the enlivening of the soil, the health of the soils, and also the structure of the soils and the plant life. So I would advise for everybody to just do it. Essentially, the synthetic chemicals that are used stop carbon sequestration by around 50%. It also has water holding capacity benefits as well. So I would suggest anyone wanting to look at regenerative agriculture in terms of climate change. I think it's the one factor that could change the world. If we can, with all our agricultural practice, sequester carbon and hold it in the soil, we are going to make an impact on the carbon emissions, not just by becoming carbon zero, but actually by changing that story about being able to change climate change and carbon emissions. Thank you very much. Everyone needs to do it now. Thank you. Regenerative agriculture is...
And I have another one. She did it in two seconds.
Hello. First of all, before starting, I'd like to acknowledge the Wadandi people, the traditional custodians of the land where I am now. With respect, elders past, present and emerging. Regenerative agriculture is really how nature works without humans on it in some ways. It's about restoring land that has been left degraded by human activity. In our case, we're a certified biodynamic carbon positive property where our soils sequester more carbon than our business emits. How we got there, the biodynamics really through the microbiological life of Preparation 500. It's like your gut biome, healthy gut, healthy mind, healthy soils, healthy vines, healthy grapes, great wine, hopefully. But the story of that and how you go about that, you basically have to start. Stop using synthetic chemicals, which stop the sequestering of 50% of carbon, get healthy soils through the biodynamics, through your compost, through your cover crops. The biodynamics actually just creates the Preparation 500, the microbiology of the internet highway under the ground, which helps all the plants grow specifically with respect to carbon capturing. It's the multi-species cover crop, which we slash, and then because of the microbiology in the soil, it is degraded and goes into the soil and stays there. It doesn't blow off as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as it would were the soil's not in good condition. So that's really the core of it. I think that we started off as carbon neutral, where we offset our emissions by planting paying for planting of trees in biodiversity corridors. It was from 2007, $25,000 a year. And now we're in a position where we are, holding more carbon than our business emits, which means we don't, but it's the first time it's happened, being carbon positive in that way because of your soil carbon sequestration. So it's a really great outcome. We were surprised. We didn't expect it. It can be done. Climate change is the great existential crisis that globally we're all living in. The wine industry can play a huge part. Agriculture is a great, or one of the largest contributors to emissions. So we can all start now and do something. We've got to stop talking about it and act because time's running out. So with all that in mind, I think that it's really climate change, great wine, regenerative agriculture. It's all about nature and its complexities, and it's a beautiful thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanya. Liz, before you explain your version of what is regenerative agriculture and you share your research, I want to prompt with a question right away, is that it's always been my understanding, or anyway, people are saying that it's more difficult to practice regenerative agriculture in Australia because the soils are more poor. Is it true, or?
I don't know that I can answer that question. Often people talk about Australia having ancient soils, but I wonder, sorry, Dylan, I wonder if Dylan might have have a view on that. It's not something that I've contemplated, and I'm hesitant to speculate.
I'm a freelancer, so I'll say no. You can do regen ag anywhere. It's just being well. Everyone's got a different definition. My definition is that every year you leave the soil or the site in a better state than it was last year. So you're not just taking.
And perhaps to add to that, Michelle, thanks, Dylan. We have producers in Australia that are practicing regen ag. Like Vanya's not the only one. There's plenty of them. So how hard can it be? I would have said that it's about improving your soil qualities. So everyone, it doesn't matter where you start, you're going to go up.
Thank you. So Liz, can you maybe share with us, in your view, what it is, your definition of regenerative agriculture, and also perhaps share some of the research you're doing right now on this, because it's the topic of the hour.
Yeah, totally. And I love Vanya's call to action there, and we would repeat that. So the research, there's research on this across the globe. One Australia's investing in research primarily at the University of Adelaide. So I'm the lucky person talking about it, but I'm not the person actually doing any of this. So I just want to make that really clear. I'm not the expert here. But how we are seeing regenerative agriculture, it's sort of in two veins. And I think because of, given that this is a webinar about climate change, I want to talk more about how it fits into that sphere. So, I'd throw in another term here, regenerative agriculture, sort of hard to say. What about carbon sequestration? That's another difficult one. But really what we're talking about is trying to get more carbon in the soil so that it's not in the atmosphere. So we're mitigating against climate change. On this other hand, it's also trying to get more carbon in the soil because that makes the soil, that increases your soil health, and you really get a better result from your vineyard. And so, maybe I've made it more complicated putting up two different aspects there. But carbon's like the soil, the glue in the soil that helps hold everything together. So that increases your water holding capacity, but it's also food for all of the microbiota that live in the soil. So your soil health increases as well. So you get an increase in biodiversity. So, the carbon in your vegetation in terms of cover crops or, other material that's growing in your vineyard, you're getting increases in biodiversity, and you're getting some gains in water management as well. So it's a really good idea. Vanya is absolutely correct. Everyone should be doing this. And in fact, vineyards already sequester carbon into the soil. And the focus of the research that's been undertaken in Australia, and it would be elsewhere, is pretty much how do we maximise this? How do we make it easier for vineyards to do this, or easy for this to occur? Because of its role in mitigating against climate change, but also because it enhances sustainability and resilience in vineyards. And of course, there's no silver bullet. What was the date that Vanya mentioned they started on this? It was, it's probably 15 years ago. So there's no silver bullet, and it's not fast. But the closest the best thing, or the closest thing to a silver bullet, is cover crops. So other material that's grown in vineyards under vine and in the rows. Bare earth is a bad idea, where, you know, anything that's not bare earth is going to help with carbon sequestration. And look, this reduces emissions also, because less tractor passes, because you're not spraying herbicides or dealing with the, you know, trying to remove anything that's growing in vineyards that isn't a grapevine. The current focus of work at Wine Australia is investing is on native grasses, so Australian species. What's commonly used in vineyards are introduced species, and actually that might be the best option. I mean, grapevines are introduced species as well when you think about it. They're not native to Australia. But there's there's almost like a toolbox of different things that could be planted in vineyards, and we're looking at whether how you establish native grasses, native Australian grasses, and add them to the mix as well. Probably the last thing to say is that, you know, carbon sequestration through planting cover crops requires patience. I don't think we're talking about old vine sort of patience, as in hundreds of years, but certainly probably 5 years before a result's seen. I can pop some links up to some information about our current research projects on this topic. Well, I'll pop some links up on that, so that more people can look at the greater detail that we have around what's been done from a research point of view. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. One of the questions I have for you is, how do you measure, because you're looking at different species for cover crop to maximize, you know, Vanya was saying that she's now carbon negative as a result. I'm just curious, how do you measure the number of carbon that's getting synced into the soil as a result? Is it difficult?
It's not so much difficult. It could be expensive, but the difficulty comes from not a complete standardization on what methods should be used and how you should count. You know, what do you count when you include in a claim like being carbon positive or carbon negative? And that's an ongoing piece of work. And look, it's not just for viticulture. This is across all agriculture, and it's globally. You know, how we measure it in Australia? Will that satisfy the supermarkets in the UK who you know, are requiring a number or a metric around this? So that's an active topic of research. You know, eventually we want to get to the point where it's simple and cheap to measure, because, you know, when you measure things, then you can improve.
And are you, is there a collaboration between different countries to come to one standardized way to calculate the carbon sequestration?
Yeah, that's an active topic. You know, it's not quite as bad as achieving world peace, but, you know, up there. It's everyone has a different way of doing things, but it's important. It's important that we standardize that.
And I know you're also doing some research on the role of microbiome. Is the microbiome helping in that carbon sequestration?
So absolutely, it's you know, healthy soil it's all part of the cycle. When you want to have a greater look, that's another thing that probably needs to be measured too. More diversity in the soil, more microbiota, you've got more cycling then of the material that makes things available for the grapevine. So yeah, that's another part of the story.
And that can reduce fertiliser inputs, as well as increasing water use efficiency as well through natural cycling, because we know that if you go and put phosphorus fertiliser out, it shuts down the soil's ability to supply phosphorus, and P is something that locks up within weeks of application. So we've got these big latent pools in the soil that the plants can't get to because we keep conventionally shutting down their access. So if we step away from that and look after the microbiota and seed Pseudomonas and bacteria and things like that and feed them with carbon, like Liz said, from cover crops, then we can reduce our reliance on some of these synthetic fertilizers or external inputs. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to tell everyone, some of the questions are getting answered as we go in the chat by our speakers. So make sure that you check. And at the end, we'll answer those who were not fully answered. Before we go on to have a discussion with the two panelists, I want to talk about water, but I also want to talk about the new grapes being planted in Australia. You know, I find it fascinating when you look, for example, at Bordeaux. They've been doing a research for now over a decade, and it has resulted in integrating new grapes within the appellation that we never thought of. But something like this in France is long and complicated because they do have so many rules and legislation. What's quite striking is when you go to Australia, most specifically, I'd say if you go to Merklyn Vale, it's amazing the work that's being done by producers in terms of investigating other grapes that are perhaps more adapted. And I just wanted to share some thoughts of Stephen Pannell because he was going to send a video and they're in the middle of the harvest, so it didn't happen. But I talked about this topic a lot with Stephen over the last couple of years. And Stephen always says, you know, we adopted what the French do because we think it's, you know, the French were always the best. We always look at France as a role model. And James Busby went to France and brought back cutting from France. But, you know, if his boat had gone to Greece or Italy, we would probably have grapes from those countries and not France, right? So it's not because it was necessarily the best suited, it's that what came to the country and it was seen as prestigious. Of course, some of those grapes are shining in Australia and they're thriving. But what's interesting now is looking in some of the areas and saying, well, in this area, you know, in Merklyn Vale, for example, is Shiraz really the most adapted grape? And I asked Stephen Pannell about it because he's actually been pulling some of his hectares, replanting to new grapes. Stephen has about 20 different grapes planted. He's playing with Acertico and Touriga Nacional and Tempranillo, Montepulciano, Alianico, Fiano. And you know, when you hear that from the outside, sometimes you're a bit skeptical. You're like, okay, how many people have tried to plant Nebbiolo and Sangiovese in other countries, and you taste the wine and it doesn't quite work. And you go to Merklyn Vale and you do some blind tasting. I remember doing a blind tasting of Fianos from Campania versus Merklyn Vale. It was very difficult actually to pick the Fiano from Italy versus the one in Merklyn Vale, because those grapes actually, it's not about imitating Italy, but it's just to say that those grapes from Spain, from Italy, from Greece are actually adapting to the region and to the drying condition. They also better adapted to drought. They take less water and a lot of them have less pH. So Stephen was talking a lot about the pH. He said, you know, these days when I harvest my Shiraz, I get a pH sometimes at 3.7, 3.8. And it's so high that I need to add water if I want my wine to ferment to dryness. So now, is it really natural when I have to have, you know, if you need to add water to ensure that it's completed fermentation, in addition to that, it's going to be challenging for microbial stability. You might need to add more sulfur to be more stable. So is it really the most adapted grape? It is for some areas, for sure. We have amazing Shiraz in Australia, but it's just interesting to see at which other options in some areas could be an answer to the growing trend of the rising temperature. He was giving me an example. Is like when I harvest my Montepulciano or my Touriga Nacional, I have 3.4 pH rather than 3.8, you know, at the Shiraz, with a big difference. And you were saying Barbera, I even have to decidify because it's like I can get a pH of 3.2 sometimes. So really, really interesting. And I want to bring Liz and Dylan with this discussion because I'm curious to hear your thought of the experimentation going right now with other grapes, but also Australia has created hybrids. France, we know that France is now using them in some of the appellation, the newly developed hybrids, but those hybrids are also getting developed in Australia. Are they being embraced by producers? Are they just an experiment, or people are really planting them and kind of seeing how they are going to go?
Liz, do you want to take this one first, or?
I can. So the hybrid work that's been done in Australia, it has been a focus on bringing in disease resistance to the the European grapevine variety, and using conventional breeding techniques. So sort of smart GM to aid with the speeding up the process, but the breeding is all conventional breeding. They're not GM grapevines. And they're hybrids. Maybe 6 generations ago, it was an American species that was hybridized with or bred with a European species, or a Chinese grape variety, 4 generations ago. We've got so the materials, the first generation of these hybrids are in commercial trials by a range of different wine companies in Australia. No one's using that for commercial production at this point. That's in the trial stage. And, the next step is to what the breeders call pyramiding. So, bring in more than one gene. You don't really want just one gene that gives you the resistance, because that can quite easily be overcome. You need a backup that does it in a different way. So you bring in some more genes. So they're not being used yet commercially. There's some, it's one of those topics that polarizes producers in Australia. Either people are incredibly excited to get their hands on them and just want to plant them, or people just think, well, no, I'm never going to plant anything that's not a known variety. I won't be able to sell something if it's not Shiraz. I'm being extreme here, but that there's a polarized view there. There is a lot of interest in some of the new gene editing techniques, which are probably not going to be classified as GM. So we're at a point of, as a research funding organisation for the wine sector, we probably need to move into this new point of looking at how do you do gene editing in grapevines. It's not like in Australia. Well, we could actually just sit back and let the Italians and the French and the North Americans do all this, and then try and import into Australia all those new varieties. But that will set us back such a long way, a long time. We need to get stuff through quarantine. Cuttings come in, they're in quarantine for at least a year, probably 2 years. Sometimes things don't come through. You bring in 5 cuttings, you get 1 at the end. So for us, it's okay, we need to do this within Australia, because otherwise we'll be left behind, and we won't have those advantages that maybe will help our sector deal with climate change in another way. So that's a long answer to your question. Yes, there are hybrid varieties, and they're actually really good. There's all sorts of, that's probably what we have, 20 different reds and 20 different whites. Some of the reds have red flesh, have great colour. When they're tasted in blind tastings, often our producers prefer them to, let's say, the Cabernet and the Shiraz grown in that same region. It's now come down to a business decision about, do you plant these things and what do you call them?
Mm-hmm.
And look, while I've still got the microphone, I think it's probably worth, Steve Pannell talking about alternative varieties and bringing in material that wasn't classically grown in France. The project that we invested in really a couple of years ago, where one of our grapevine germplasm collections just got this wealth of material from all over the place. So 500 different grape varieties were followed over several seasons and collected a whole lot of data on, when do they flower, have they got, what's the berry colour, what's the yields, a whole lot of, that sort of material, information about what these grapevine varieties, how they performed over several seasons. And then you know, like, what do you do with that information? It's huge. We've squished it into, that's a technical term there. So we've put all that information into an online tool. So, you know, and I'll put the link in the chat for that. But if a producer is looking for something different, they go in, they can select what berry color, what's the acidity like, and put this into the tool, and it will give them a whole wealth of, maybe you should consider this variety that you've never heard of before. Yeah, there's 465 different varieties in there. It's just hours of fun playing with that.
That's great. And Dylan, I'm curious to see, you're on the other side. So you're working with clients recommending. So someone comes to you, do you recommend those hybrids or to plant some or no? What is your take on those newly developed hybrids?
Yeah, so the wine industry is kind of stratified, and I work in the sector with small to medium producers, and I've got producers that if we could get Gen 2 hybrids now, tomorrow, to put in the ground, they'd do it because they don't care about what variety it is. If they can make a solid red wine and communicate to people, hey, this had the tractor pass 3 times and all we did was cut the grass, or you know, the minimal fungicide to keep mites under control, like 2 sulfurs in a year, that would sell. So they're not so concerned about needing to have a variety so that someone recognises it on a supermarket shelf or it gets a specific listing. So I'm really excited about seeing where our locally produced hybrids can go, and I know they're being tested in different growing regions as well at the moment, where they're under trial. So I'm very interested in some of the work that I've seen in Catalonia and in Europe about the Peewee programs where they're crossing with native varieties like Mataros and Macabeos and things and Grenaches. To go out there in a high pressure season, have weeds up to your earlobes, no tractor tire marks, and perfectly clean canopies to the top wire is mind blowing. Whereas you go to their Chardonnay that they sprayed 14 times. That's very stark.
And bringing this to old vine, and this is a question for both of you. So if you think of the longevity, if you think further, some people are saying, well, those newly developed grapes over time, you know, it might be good for now, but they might lose their resistance with, you know, in 20 years from now, let's say. So do you think that, you know, if you want to promote older vines or vineyards that are lasting longer, is it worth it, you think, to plant, to rely on those grapes, knowing that they might lose their resistance?
So the worst case scenario, that would be a real issue if you didn't own a tractor. But worst case scenario is that you go back to conventional or organic management. You can still manage them. They're not going to die if they lose resistance. But because I mentioned Gen 2, which is multi-locus, so instead of having just one gene that gets knocked out, you've got multiple genes protecting, plus our knowledge of managing to avoid resistance. If you go out there and spray the wrong things at the wrong times or let disease get out of control, you're selecting for the pathogen to find a way around the genes. No, we need to be smart in the way that we manage these things, and I think that they'll be solid well into the future.
So Liz and Dylan, can you tell us maybe one grape being developed in Australia that you're excited about?
Their names aren't that great at the moment.
No. So with the hybrids, so the disease-resistant ones, these don't have names at this point. They are, you know, W52 /7. So pretty much whoever wants to take this on as a, you know, once we have great Gen 2 hybrids out there, people can call it whatever they like. First in, best dressed. Well, within reason, obviously. You can't call it whatever you like, but yeah, and there's been some, just on that, there's been quite a bit of discussion about what do you call these things, you know, and how do you pick a name? I'd like to think that we look at some of the First Nations words, so use some of the languages from First Nations to describe these, because they're unique Australian varieties. They're bred in Australia for Australian conditions. But yeah, watch this space. I mean, here I am sitting, you know, as a former researcher now working within a funding organisation for wine for Australia. I don't have vineyards, so I don't have skin in the game, but I just think this is just such an opportunity for a wine company to take these varieties on and do something really truly unique that is also sustainable.
And we're so lucky because in Europe, where I work in Spain, they've got the hybrids, they can get them, but the DO won't allow them to put them in the wine.
Yeah, and that's so amazing, because I did a seminar on hybrids with the Italians and the Spanish, and the discussion was completely different, and it's a lot more polarized, right? It's very divisive in terms of whether you should plant it or not. So it's really interesting to see the view of the Australian, very different. I want to ask both of you, one of the big topic when we think of climate change is water. And, you know, when we're in North America, we always forget how rare the water is in a place like Australia, and the fact that people actually have to pay for water, you know, if you want to use it, and it's a big cost added to your production. People forget about that. For people listening, and I know there's some winemakers from different places in the world listening to us right now, I know that it's a complicated topic and there's a lot to talk about, but from what you've learned in Australia and water becoming more and more of a problem, what are some of the advice you could share in terms of dealing with the ongoing drought difficulties?
I might just jump in first, Dylan, if that's all right, because I think you can give an on-the-ground practical response to that. So it's interesting to talk about Australia and water, particularly at the moment. So we're not in drought now. We've just had way too much rain and flooding. But you know, this not in wine regions, fortunately, but it's a topic that it's always a topic of interest, because there's something about water. It's either too much or too little. It comes down to better management of water resources. Yes, it costs money to use water. So are you putting it on at the right time? Are you tailoring your irrigation to what your vineyard actually needs or what the plants need? So there's some really exciting stuff happening at the moment around tech or ag tech to help with all of this water scheduling concept. So eventually it could get down to individual plants. So there's a, you know, this particular vine in this spot in the vineyard needs this amount of water. The one further away needs a different amount. So, you know, real tailored water delivery. We're not at that point yet, and it might actually be, that might be a dream. It might not be, you know, commercially viable to get down to that level, but that's where we're heading. You know, don't put more on than you need, and put it on at the time when you need it. In fact, Dylan, maybe you mentioned earlier about, or maybe it was you, Michelle, about winter drought. You know, that's been a really interesting project and a set of observations. Yeah, vineyards are dormant in winter. You know, they're not growing, but actually, if you don't have enough rain in water, you don't have enough water in the ground, and that's a real issue for spring growth. So, you know, understanding when to water and how much water needs to be available at different times of the growing season. That's the key to managing it.
Exactly. And also in the changing climate, if I could speak, Liz, it's not just, you know, when to use it and how to manage it, it's increasing the efficiency of a finite or a very limiting resource. So water use efficiency is something that in Australia we all talk about. And Michelle, you might talk to producers and they're like, it's water when you water. But we have to pay for it and we have to plan for it. And sometimes we have to order and buy the water well in advance and put it in a dam and hold it on our block. And when it's gone, it's gone. So there's a lot of tools that I know Wine Australia have invested heavily in that help us as growers things from indirect measurements. Like when I first started working in Spain, the first thing I did was get soil probes, because in Australia, every vineyard has a soil probe, because then, you know, if you put water on here, you can see it go down and you can see the vines take it. So there's indirect measurements of water, so you're not over or under watering. And the evolution of technology means now we've got direct measurements of water use, which are things like psychrometers or dendrometers, so a collar that goes around a vine and measures the shrink and swell of the vine every day, or uses heat flux, so a couple probes or a band that heats up the sap, and then by the temperature drop, it can tell how much sap is passing through that trunk and being transpired out there as those leaves. So like Liz said, we know exactly how many millimeters of water that vine or that plant has used, and we can actually watch on a screen when the stomata close. So when it approaches stress and the plant in its own mind or body shuts down. And that can allow us to really fine tune and save water and use water just when the plant needs it, so we're not overdoing it or underdoing it. And the last, or another piece of that, is using remote sensing and satellites, so that we can see reflectance of, say, chlorophyll efficiency or things like that, to target areas of a vineyard, so that we know that if we're overwatering here, we can go out and we can change the flow rate of the emitters, or we can put in some taps, or we can put in another line if we need more water. So water use efficiency and tools to monitor that are becoming a lot more technologically advanced. And we take some of our technology from other countries that are also reliant on irrigation, but applying it to agriculture is very, very exciting, and we're all pretty active on that front.
Have you seen that from using the probes and the dendrometer and the satellite, that some vineyards have stopped irrigating altogether, or very little? Like, what's the difference once you start making those measures? Can you give us an example of a vineyard you work with?
I can give you a real example. But first, I'll say that when you put in a soil probe, I mean, I think we've seen that with deficit irrigation, so allowing the vine to stress to a point, or knowing where the dry point is before you apply water, you can have huge savings of water, like a third of your water, for example. And then if you include dendrometers or plant-based measures, you can save maybe the same again. It compounds and you can save a lot of water. But to give a real quick example, I know of a business that was using heat collars to measure sap flow to use for irrigation scheduling in a warm climate. So this was in the Barossa, and they had been using soil probes, so indirect measurements, for a long time. They got these heat collars put on, and it was a company in France that was setting them up and was managing it with them. And in France, they're looking at it going, all right, we can see, bang, when the stomata are open and when we're transpiring water because the sap flow. Then when they close, we can measure the time that is, and the earlier they close each day means that you're approaching a critical stress point. And you can read where that stress point is in the plant. So this guy's got a heat wave coming, and he's like this is me talking to France. I'm going to irrigate because I have to, because we've got 3 40-degree days coming. There's a hot northerly. I would always irrigate. No, you're not irrigating. Yeah, I have to give him a drink. No, you don't. The stomata say the plant's fine. You're going to waste your water. Okay, I'm going to irrigate half the vineyard. He irrigated the vineyard and the vines looked great through the irrigation. He also listened to the technology and trusted these guys, even though he's saying the vapor pressure deficit, the humidity is so low, like, you're not sitting here, it's hot as hell. And they said, hold your line. And after that, the one that was irrigated and the one that was not irrigated, they looked the same 3 days later. So he actually saved water, and then that was a big confidence booster to go, wow, okay, we can really push this technology to work efficiently with our water.
That's great. That's great. I just want to show to Anne, and then I'm going to take a few questions, and we're going to the end here. But we've been talking about how Australia is open-minded, and that's helping to push things forward. And I could not hand the presentation without talking about packaging. You know, packaging is a big part of the carbon footprint of a wine bottle. And again, Australia has always been so open to use alternative packaging, especially for everyday drinking. When we know that 99% of the wine that we purchase are drank within the first 24 hours. So do we really need that heavy bottle with that cork every time? Perhaps not. You know, there's a lot of different options when it comes to cans, it comes to bag-in-box, but also for kegs. If you are a producer and you're selling directly to a restaurant, you can even sell to in kegs. So I wanted to, before we go to a few questions, to share a video with Richard Angove. Angove is a winery. They have vineyards in the Riverland, in McLean Vale, and they actually believe in packaging. And they've done a lot of work to use lightweight bottle and alternative packaging. Just sorry, my video has disappeared. The beauty of technology when you need it. Just bear with me for a second. I did a test right before everything was working. Okay, there we go.
Sustainability does go further than just viticulture at Angove Family Winemakers. It's a wider business mindset and philosophy. For example, all of our Angove organic wines are packaged in lightweight glass, 30% less glass, and they're much lighter than the average wine bottle, meaning in transportation of a 6-pack of wine, you're reducing your carbon footprint. We're also investing in things like solar power. So we have 200 kilowatts of solar power on our warehouse roof, which accounts for about 20% of our total energy needs. We're a signatory to the National Packaging Covenant, which means we're always looking for continuous improvement and recycling everything that we possibly can. We have a large woodlot surrounding the winery, which means that our diverted wastewater stream doesn't just go down the drain, it goes out and grows trees, which is fantastic.
I really invite you to go to their website. I did a presentation in Vancouver with Richard, and they did so much work into finding the lightest weight, the lightweight bottle, and they've developed an amazing program with local restaurants, with kegs. So I hope it inspires other producers listening to us. We need to get the consumer on board. It's a much more conservative. I know in Montreal, you know, the monopoly, and the consumers are more conservative in that regard. But if I look at markets like Sweden, where 51% of the wine on the shelves are in bag-in-box and good quality wine, I think we need to push forward, and we need to seriously really think about alternative packaging and stop being so attached to that heavy bottle, because the planet is, you know, there's a deadline. So we need to do everything we can in that regard. Dylan, and we have time for a few questions, and most of the questions actually been answered throughout. So thanks, Dylan and Liz, for doing that. I saw one of the questions not being answered from Maude. I saw someone. So Maude was asking, what could be an example of an old vine versus young vine epigenic response to a stress event, such as extreme drought? So how would you see, you know, in the same vineyard, old vine, young vine?
You would possibly see a change in the plant's water use efficiency. So a younger vine might stress less. So visibly, you might see some basal senescence or yellowing of the leaves, or an earlier cessation of shoot growth. So you end up with shorter shoots, or you may have faster ripening of the fruit. So a rapid increase in sugar and a quick decrease in acidity. I think that we measured a lot, but I didn't measure directly some of those things. But that study on Zinfandel out of in California would tie right into that question. I'll see if I've got a link for that one.
I have one question for you. So if we look into the future, and I always believe in sharing when we look at the news in regards to climate change, it's always very alarmist. It's always those pictures with the burner and people losing vine. And we focus very much on the dramatic side of it rather than the solution. And this is why I started this conference and this symposium, is that people would focus on the solutions. If we focus on the drama, we have no hope. So with that, if you could maybe, from your experience, if you could share one thing or two things that is giving you hope in terms of the solution that a country like Australia, but also other regions that are experiencing extreme, that we have what it takes to adapt and mitigate. We need a few sentences of hope here from you.
I'll go first. I think that we will prevail, and we've got technology on our side, and we've still got so much to learn. We've been using blunt tools for so long and ignoring or disrespecting the soils and the plants, that if we actually tune in, not just in wine, but in agriculture in general, I think that we've got quite a buffer to deal with and live with the changing climate.
Thank you. Liz?
And it's about resilience and innovation. So, grapevines have been grown for a long time, and the climate's changed much more dramatically recently. But so many other things have changed in people's environment throughout this whole period. I think we've got several things on our side, and the first one is the grapevine itself. There's such diversity in the germplasm. So there will be grapevines that will thrive in different environments, new environments that they'll find themselves in. I'm confident about that. And we're already seeing, we already have evidence of that. And people are innovative. People are resilient too. Like, we've got a bunch of very smart people around the world looking at this problem. And when I say that, I don't mean the researchers, only the researchers. I mean, we have this wealth of knowledge in everyone who's involved in the wine sector. There's so much wisdom from producers that have lived it and seen it on the land. So it'll be different. The future will be different, but it will still have fabulous wine from all sorts of places around the world. I'm confident of that.
Agree.
And Dylan added in the chat box that he's excited to have an electric tractor.
Okay, well, and when it's electric and autonomous, that'd be great.
I want to add to that. I just want to leave you on, I feel the same when I wrote the book last year for the trade on the solution to adapt and mitigate climate change. I did so much research and I talked to so many people from all over the world, the producers, and the solutions are there. I think what we need to do is to make sure that we communicate those solutions, because, we're all busy doing our things and finding ways to adapt. But I think if we continue to share the solution in this very fragmented wine industry, I think the future is bright and much brighter than what the news numbers are telling us if we all work together. I really believe this. I really want to thank both of you for getting up so early and being with us to share your insight and your knowledge. And I want to thank everyone for being there. Thank you, Wine Australia, for this collaboration. I invite you to copy and paste those links that Liz and Dylan shared with us. Wine Australia, the AWRI have a lot of information as well. If you want to dig further, I think it's worth it. And if you have any questions, you know how to reach me. You can go to info@Tasting Climate Change, and I look forward to the next seminar in April. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.